Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History.
Thank you to Sarah Strange for talking to us. We are right now standing on the balcony of the Senate and the Parliament in Brussels, which is one of the most important buildings in Belgium.
That's true, Louis. Just behind us is the Nation Square of Belgium. During the Belgian Revolution, the revolutionaries Louis de Potter and Jean de Bien were standing here in front of a huge crowd after defeating the Dutch army. Louis de Potter was about to declare the Belgian Republic, his long dream.
Yes, however, his co-revolutionary, Jean de Bien, was scared that this republic would not survive, especially after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. Also, all the neighboring countries, except for France, were monarchies. So, when they had his speech on the balcony, Jean de Bien pulled Louis de Potter by the neck to make sure he would not declare the republic.
Louis de Potter remained silent and Belgium took a turn towards a constitutional monarchy. Welcome, Mr. Dennis de Vriese to High on History. We are seated now in the reading chamber of the Senate of Belgium. It's a beautiful place to be. This is where, on this big table, there used to be all the newspapers, and the politicians still actually today come here, they read the news, they talk about the next topic, and then actually they're where they would be before they go to the Senate chamber and vote the laws. So actually it's here where the real decisions are made. And just thank you once again for being here. Could you please be so kind to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you for having me. I am Dennis de Vriese. I am a pre-doctoral historical researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, where I specialize in the 19th century economic and political history of this great city of Brussels.
Fantastic. So we ended our last episode with Sarah Strange, and we talked about the French Revolution and also Napoleon Bonaparte. We won the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. Why was it so important for this region and for Brussels?
Well, the Battle of Fleurus is both an ending and a beginning, in a sense. What happens is that the French, under the command of one of Napoleon's generals, beat the Austrian Empire, the empire's forces, who then retreat and eventually abandon the region. So it's the end of about 80 years of Austrian rule in our regions and about 2 centuries of Habsburg rule effect. And what begins is French conquest. So it's very much the French conquer what we call the southern Low Countries, southern Netherlands, what would become Belgium, which means that literally we become a part of France. The region is subdivided into certain departments along the lines of the French département, so we've just become a handful of extra départements to France. So that means that Brussels, once the regional capital of the southern Low Countries, is demoted to simply being a provincial capital of the Département de la Dyle, as it's called, which corresponds with current Brussels, Flemish Brabant and Walloon Brabant, so that region. So Brussels loses its position as a central capital. Now, as part of France, de facto, we have a lot of the changes that are enacted in Paris, which influence us as well, which we can call the end of the Ancien Régime, so about the several hundred years worth of period before that, where a lot of the old ways and traditions of how things were done are abolished. The old units and measures are abolished and removed, and we get new, more streamlined, the kilogram and the second and those kinds of things. The old ways of producing, like within the corporate guild structure, are abolished, and there's all kinds of new ways to do that. So the Ancien Régime, the 400-year thereabouts way of how our life is organized, was suddenly changed with the dramatic introduction of all these principles of the French Revolution.
But the French rule was not so long, because people all around the world, they know the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where the French and Napoleon was actually defeated by the English-led coalition. It's only just a 15-minute drive away from Brussels, so we wonder, how did that influence then Brussels?
Well, it's a very intense period, so once again we have a tremendous change. So what happens is, after the Battle of Waterloo, the main powers in Europe at that time, so we're talking about the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Prussian Kingdom, the British, and the French as the defeated power, they gather in Vienna, in the Congress of Vienna, with a very specific plan of trying to prevent anything like the Napoleonic Wars from ever happening again, trying to constrain France's ambitions and also literally try to hem in France's possibilities for expansion. And it takes a number of different shapes, but for our story here, most important is the establishment of what they call a buffer state. So what they decide in Vienna is to join the northern and the southern Low Countries together in a kind of new state meant to physically inhibit French ambitions from ever starting to conquer again after a century in which we have various types of French conquests. And this was quite useful, in fact, because the southern Low Countries had become a bit of a problem in the fact that, in theory, according to international law at the time and custom, the Austrian emperor was the legitimate ruler of the southern Low Countries. He had been chased out by the French and now he should have returned. But the Austrians, for about 100 years, had grown quite tired of the southern Low Countries. They were far away. There were many elites and cities who didn't really like to be told what to do, like Brussels. And the fabulous wealth that had once been there as the main pole of attraction had, well, after a year and years of wars and armies marching hither and thither and being chased out and conquering again, the general wealth had more or less dried up. So the Austrians were very happy to let go of this part of their empire, in fact. So they were joined together with the northern Netherlands into what was called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and it seemed a very good solution for all powers to maintain the status quo. But after more than 200 years of being separate, north and south, well, they were quite different people, and it would prove to be quite an uneasy and forced marriage between the two.
Was it enforced marriage? We know today Belgium, which is of course just part of that country. So how did we come from this, this southern Netherlands, state toward the Belgian state? So was Belgium born actually?
Well, as I mentioned before, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, so joining with our northern neighbors, had always been a bit tense. There were differences in religion, north-south, there were differences in language spoken, the economy, so the economical focus was different. There was frustration in the south that the new country had to absorb the debts of the old country, which meant that a lot of the southerners, so to speak, felt that they were paying for all their northern wars of the last 200 years. With quite a lot of resentment. And in the south specifically, that resentment was focused on two distinct groups, which you could say had both a different approach to the legacy of the French Revolution. On the one hand, there were the liberals who felt that the new kingdom under William I of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands did not go far enough in embracing the legacy of the French Revolution in terms of equality and freedom and representation. They felt that the elections were a bit shady. In fact, it was very unclear. It was a tired and complex process, and it was not clear where votes went to exactly. They felt, partly rightly, partly unfairly, that William was acting a lot outside of Parliament, so ignoring the will of the people as in theory reflected by parliamentarians. And the freedom of the press was really, really limited. So liberals felt that this was not going far enough into, let's say, modernity. On the other hand, there was a large Catholic group in southern Low Countries who had quite the opposite reflex. The French, when they had conquered in 1794-95, had seized a lot of the assets of the Catholic Church, but William, as the new government, was uninclined to give them back. He was also steadily encroaching upon education, which was traditionally the field for the Catholic Church. So basically, both the liberals and the Catholics really did not like the new state structure, and exemplified by William. But for about 15 years, they more or less more hated each other than they hated King William. So that kind of worked out in a sense. It's only that in the late 1820s that they start to join together in what is called like the union of the Catholics and the liberals working together. And they start a campaign of petitions, of leaflets, of articles claiming and demanding reform and a different way of organizing the states. And the central states, under guidance of William, responds relatively harshly. They push down on freedom of the press. They arrest important figures in this intellectual movement. Like, for example, Leopold II is one of the main proponents of reform and changing the way that this country is run at this point. They imprison him on charges of conspiracy. And this imprisonment, along with the fact that he can keep on writing in prison and spreading his words, kind of further inflames and fans the embers of discontent. So then when we go into 1830 in the summer, it's a really, something's brewing in Europe. There are revolutions across the continent. There's a lot of hunger and famine because of failed harvests. Unemployment is on the rise. People are frustrated, getting poor or hungry. And it's in this context of both like the principal objections of the Catholics and liberals and the general poverty and resentment that on the 25th of August, 1830, here in Brussels, in the Théâtre de la Monnaie, not very far from here, there's a performance of the opera, the Muette de Portici, which is a story, a 16th century story, about a revolt in Naples against Spanish rulers. That's, in essence, that's more or less what it is. But it very much touches upon those nationalism and those frustrations in the audience, which is mostly young, liberal, like, easily excitable young men. And they touch upon these things like a few brave men standing in front of a large-scale foreign oppression. They call it the amour sacré de la patrie, so the sacred love of the fatherland. It's really pretty heavy. So what follows is a riot, inflamed young liberals rioting in the city, and they are very quickly joined by these poor and hungry laborers until we get a fully riot and uprising. And then the national government, so in the shape of William, decide, perhaps wisely, to retreat their military troops, which had been stationed in Brussels, to avoid a bloodbath, because that was really brewing. But that means that we're left with a power vacuum in Brussels, and the city more or less given over to the riotous crowd. So the liberal city leaders and city council, they construct a civil militia to try and restore order. And suddenly these reformist powers have their own military arm, and then they starting to dream of an independent country. And while eventually William would use military force, it would fail to conquer the region again, and thus the independent state of Belgium was born.
They failed. That's something special. You know? So why would the professional army of the Netherlands, of the Dutch king, fail actually against just some rioters in Brussels? Is there? I heard there's maybe some ex-militia. They joined in from the Napoleonic Wars. Is there something to that as well?
Well, in the very least, our areas had seen quite a lot of warfare in past decades, and also during the Napoleonic rule, one of the main beefs of contention was the bones of contention, rather, was the military conscription duty. So it meant that quite a lot of people in the southern Netherlands had served in some capacity in the army, so had some military experience to fall back on. Exactly, and also added with the fact that William I was, in a sense, limited in the amount of resources he could throw at it, in the sense that in Vienna, the great powers had decided, okay, if someone breaks the rules of this new stable Europe that we've crafted, you can call upon us, the great powers, to come and help you. William was kind of counting on that, but that did not occur because the Russians were occupied with a Polish uprising in this same 1830 summer. The Austrians were equally afraid of this uprising spreading. The French were more than happy to see this hated buffer state, which was aimed specifically at them, to see it disappear. And the British, well, in British fashion, they did not really want to get involved. They were afraid of this issue starting a continental European war, and they did not think that the existence of Belgium was worth fighting a continental war.
How do we evolve actually from this revolution, this uprising, beating the Dutch army in Brussels, to a constitutional monarchy? So how did we get there? Why did we become Belgium? Why did we become a constitutional monarchy?
Well, again, we were highly dependent on let's say, the powers that be. So again, Prussia, Austria, Russia, France, and the British. And throughout all of them, there was very much the idea that monarchy represents stability, represents continuity, longevity, tradition. So that's a stable way of running a country. While republics at this time, they had the reputation of, well, the French Revolution, which wasn't all that orderly, a lot of chaos, bloodshed, and instability. A lot of revolutions going on in 1830 to have a revolution also kind of soiled the idea of a republic. So monarchy was the way to go. But given that a lot of the Belgian Revolution was about not having a autocratic king deciding everything and not looking at the interests of the people or the elites rather, the constitutional monarchy was something of a compromise in which there was a constitution which constrained what the king could and could not do and ensured, in theory, that the will of the people, as represented by admittedly very limited elections, but still the principle of the will of the people could be enacted, even if the king disagreed.
So the power of the king was much more balanced than in the previous state that we shared with
it was certainly the idea, and it also did work, because in the same sense they went on looking for a head to crown, in a sense, well, not crown because we don't have, but to have a king which would kind of respect this balance, and they ended up with Leopold I, who's, I mean, he's a German, he's very close with the English royals, he's related to royals, and he seemed willing to accept limits to his power, which turned out that he wasn't all that willing, but there would be a conflict of how far he could go, but that's
how we ended up there.
Yeah, exactly.
So Dennis, we're now in the royal chamber of the Senate of Belgium. This is where the royals would be, and before that it was called also the smoking chamber. So the royals would be here, people would smoke, so a lot of these, the chamber next is where the politicians are. Here is the royal chamber, and this has, a very important role between the monarchy and, of course, the constitutional bodies like the Senate and the Parliament. We want to continue here and talk about Belgium after the revolution, after it became constitutional monarchy. So how did Belgium fare after the independence?
Well, the first few years were quite difficult because contact with the North was cut off, and there was all kind of tensions over economic exchange between them. And the argument, there were decades of tough conversations with the Netherlands. But after a few years, the industry really picks up. Partly in Ghent, textile industry, partly, or at least the boost is due to some industrial lending or spying across the channel in the United Kingdom with spinning machines that are secretly carted over. In the south of the countries is the most important industrial area, with Wallonia, with the metal and the coal industries around Charleroi and the Maas. And Brussels very quickly becomes a central node in this economic network, both physically with, like, in 1832, the construction of the channel between Brussels and Charleroi, which allows for transport of all kinds of goods, but also financially, like more and more the banking world in Brussels decides on investments, insurances, risk assessments. So very much becomes the central node in this industrially booming country, which at this point has among the highest GDPs in Europe and the world. It's really becoming an industrial powerhouse. And this is also reflected in a number of technological feats, and I would say that the most well-known or remarkable is the construction of the very first railway on the European continent, the very first trains. Again, borrowed or inspired by Britain. The very first train riding on the European continent is in 1835 from Brussels to Mechelen. And this is a technological feat. This is economically a boost because a lot of resources can be shifted about on the gradually expanding railroads. In a later stage, we can connect to the German economic area, so another outlet for exporting and importing all kinds of things. It's also something of a tourist attraction in the beginning, and that quickly becomes a way of transporting laborers and labor across the country. And also, maybe not unimportantly, it becomes a point of pride for a very new kingdom, a very new official Belgian population, that the very first train was here. And the fact that we're talking about here in the Senate kind of implies that this point of pride still has some leftover strength.
Brussels was very much constrained in the centuries and the decades before by a lot of epidemics happening, like the cholera, many diseases linked to the River Seine, which is almost became a public sewer. Was something done about it?
Eventually, yes, but we had, or at least the Brussels inhabitants of the 19th century, had to wait half a century for things to change. The Zena, for the first 50 years, very much remained, as you say, an open sewer, a source of all kinds of diseases and pests, rats, rodents, all those kinds of things. And then added with the fact that the population of the city was growing, but it was at that point staying more or less within the city wall. So that meant that people were living more and more densely together, which is also quite useful for diseases, as we have noticed in the past few years. And we see that, as you mentioned, cholera is back with a vengeance. And between the revolution and 1866, there are no less than 6 individual cholera epidemics ravaging the country and the capital as well. And what's interesting is that we see that there's this gut feeling that these pandemics are connected to unsanitary conditions and dirty surroundings. But then in the 1830s, for example, we see regulation on, say, people who are selling vegetables have to make sure that after the market ends, they have to clean up the waste. So there's no rotting waste in the city. There's rules on slaughtering animals outside of the city. So there's very much this idea that unhealthy space leads to all these diseases. But it takes until the 1860s before they realize that the main driver is drinking water. Drinking water in spreading cholera. And this then connects with a much larger process of European cities, making cities more sanitary, more clean, more nice to live in for the wealthy, if you want to be simple about it. And that leads current mayor in the 1860s, Mayor Jules Ansbach, to decide to cover the Zenne, to kind of disconnect the city from its river. Until today, the river runs under the city rather than through the city.
So there's a lot of urbanization. There's a big urbanization works. How did the urbanization of Brussels evolve after the independence?
Well, the urban population boomed. Let's say that around 1830, there were about 150,000 inhabitants in Brussels. And once the 20th century starts, in 1900, it's about 4.5 times as many. And there are a few reasons for this. Mortality declines, so more and more people get to a certain age, or more people are surviving their youth throughout their life. There's also a large degree of immigration to the city because it's the appeal of the capital. It has more employment possibilities. It's very much a free space because of the very liberal rule throughout the 19th century. So population-wise, the city grows and booms. Area-wise, it does to a certain extent. We see small new clusters arriving around the city gates. So at this point, we're still talking about Brussels with the city walls at that point still with like a pentagon, like factors. And at the city gates, there are some new kind of mini cities erecting, but most of the population is still living inside the city. But then, as population keeps on growing, we see new neighborhoods being erected. For example, the Leopold quarter to the southeast of the city.
And the city walls that kept the population a bit, in the center. So that limited the urban boom and that prevented from people from, going to the new areas. Was something done about that as well?
Well, the conversation we're having right now must have been had, I think, even in the 1810s, 1820s. There were already plans under King William of the United Kingdom to abolish the city walls, but it's only in the 1860s that they're actually abolished, deconstructed rather, and destroyed, and replaced with very large avenues and lanes. Also in the idea of making pleasurable places to walk with gentle shrubbery and trees, making more of that kind of room. But we also see that, for example, the urbanization changes as the railway becomes ever more popular. We have the construction of North and South Brussels stations, respectively, in the 1840s and 60s. The first trams appear in the city in 1869, originally horse-drawn, but then at the end of the century they start to get electrified. There's the construction of all kinds of new, large, monumental buildings, such as the Palais de Justice, not very far from here, which was started in the 1860s as sort of a royal contest for architects, won by Poulaert, who then designed rather, the palace. It took about 20 years to finish it, but by the time it was finished in 1883, it was one of the largest buildings in the world and the largest building in Western Europe. And this palace of justice very beautifully illustrates the dual nature of the city, I find, at least in this period. On the one hand, we have a city where the city council really focused on making it a more sanitary place to live, a more clean place to live, often not really concerned with, often focused on destroying poor and ugly neighborhoods and then not concerned with where those people are going to live. So it's a double story, but very much focused on making it a more clean, healthy, and beautiful city. On the other hand, it has a capital which is constantly strapped for cash because of all these main renovations. I mean, covering the Senate costs a lot of money. And then we see that national governments, and especially the king then, also are becoming concerned with raising the appeal of the Belgian capital, not just as a city, but as, let's say, the post sign for Belgium, what it means to be Belgian. So that national governments and the king really start to help building the city of Brussels in a very beautiful way, which explains why at the time King Leopold II was mostly known as the builder king, as responsible for helping building a lot of things around the country, but mostly in Brussels.
Why was King Leopold II so important for Brussels, and also why is he such a controversial figure in history?
Well, let's start with the first part of your question. He provided a large boost to building and renovating and changing the city. The idea was very much to create a capital which could stand toe to toe with the major capitals of the time, Vienna, London, and especially Paris. Brussels had to become something of a little Paris. So under his push, for example, there were large new avenues built. For example, the Avenue Louise, not uncoincidentally named after one of his daughters, Louise. Um, Also having directed the building of the Cinquantenaire Park in the city, expanding the palace, rather not the palace in Laken, the greenhouses in Laken as well, and also the what was then called the Museum for Central Africa, which is now called the Africa Museum. And the very building also kind of illustrates why he's such a controversial figure, in that building specifically was mostly built on money extracted from Congo, which Leopold had been ruling as a personal fiefdom from 1885. The very cruel and exploitative regime treading on what we now would call human rights. And it's that legacy that is right now, perhaps rightly, known most for.
Absolutely. So he's an important figure, King Leopold II, but there were a lot more important figures here in Brussels during that period. Could you maybe elaborate a bit about the main characters?
I'd say that maybe the visitor in this century which would have the most impact would be Karl Marx. Karl Marx had been chased out of Cologne for being considered a rabble raiser and a threat to the public order. And he fled to Brussels because Brussels had a twofold attraction. First of all, it was the capital of, as we mentioned before, a constitutional monarchy, which very seriously took its freedom of the press, freedom of expression, was very much a safe place. The idea was that people could speak their mind, introduce new ideas, and develop them. And then added to that, Brussels itself was very much an extremely liberal bulwark. At times, there were liberal city councils who looked at liberal government and said, well, they call themselves liberals, but I mean, they're not liberal enough. So it was very much part of the identity of the city. Again, enshrining this idea of people are free to speak their mind. And then in 1848, when a wave of revolution swept across Europe, very similar to the one that gave birth to Belgium in 1830, they kind of changed their mind, and they become quite worried as well that something similar to 1830 will happen in Brussels as well. So then, in the end, he is, chased out at least, or asked to leave, and then he goes to Paris, where the same revolution has established a republic, where Marx hoped that he would then find his safe. But that's very much on the political dimension. I'd say that looking at the economy, one of the main players in the city could be called the Solvay brothers. So Ernest, as the most important. And together with his younger brother, he built the Solvay company, initially a small but very rapidly growing chemical firm, which would become one of the largest chemical firms in the region. And so again, kind of illustrates this role of Belgium and Brussels per excellence as source where new ideas and new things can be. But it was also, I mean, Sauvé was a fascinating figure. He also played a large role in expanding the University of Brussels, establishing a physiology department, expanding the chemistry department, sponsoring all kinds of things. He was very much a social reformer ahead of his time. He was one of the first to introduce what we would call social security measures like a pension, better working conditions, all within the idea of boosting productivity, but still it's kind of a social reform as well. And then maybe for people like walking around Brussels, I'd say that the influence of Victor Horta is also cannot be underestimated. One of the founding fathers of Art Nouveau and making Brussels into the Art Nouveau beautiful capital of the world. Again, connecting to this idea of a beautiful Paris-like city where people would be glad to come and stand in awe, in essence.
So these important figures play their role. We're now at the end of the century, going to the 1900s. What is to expect for the future for Brussels?
Yeah, the 20th century is very eventful, to put it mildly. We see quite a few things happen. Of course, the world wars kind of disturb life in the city, of course, but we see that what we could call the golden age of Belgium and Brussels lost until about the start of the First World War, where we see that, for example, the impulse of Sauvé leads to scientific conferences, bringing all kinds of new ideas and new people like Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, all this kind of melting pot of ideas and culture and wealth still derived, however unrightly so, from the colony. So that lasts until the First World War, and then entirely new period transformed the city with growth until 1970s, and then changes in the emergence of the car, which then changes the way life is lived. Brussels becomes a capital not only of Belgium, but of European institutions, national institutions, and it becomes the city we now know and I assume love today.
Which will, for sure, our next speakers will elaborate on. Thank you, Mr. Dennis de Vriese, for being on High on History.
You're very welcome.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. It's a bit hidden here in a corner. So Dennis, maybe you could elaborate this figure, why we are here and why, who is it actually?
Well, this is a statue of Louis de Potter, and we already briefly talked about him in his role in preparing revolution and kind of getting the minds ready for reform and revolution. But it says here on the statue, membre du gouvernement provisoire in 1830. So he was a very important role player in the entire revolution. You could call him one of the founding fathers of Belgium in the sense that he prepared revolution. He was part of the provisionary governments between 1830 and 1831. He had an important role to play in writing the constitution. He also was influencing the development of the Belgian flag based on the old Brabant flag. So he's really one of the main players in the emergence of Belgium as a modern monarchy that we know today. And here he is hidden behind the lampposts.
So it's a bit strange how history evolves that, now we have this hidden behind this lamppost at the reading desk in the reading room of the parliament. But an important figure for Belgium and the way Belgium functions today.